Ein gutes neues Jahr. Thank you. Hey, folks, come on in. I think there's some seats over here and a couple of them up here. I see some people standing in the back. But it is absolutely great to be here. Gary, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the thoughtful comments. You have done an extraordinary job. When we come to this academy and we see what it has become, and you realize the extraordinarily talented people who are here as fellows, and year in, year out, the contribution that you make, not only to Berlin, and to Germany, but to the transatlantic relationship is absolutely extraordinary. And I just a big round of applause for Gary Smith here. It's also great to see in the front row and have with us Richard Haas, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, of which Kimberly and I are both members. And great to have you here. I know you're a frequent visitor to Germany, and of course we have a room full of boat shafters. We've got my predecessor John Kornblum, and we have the ambassador to the United States from Germany during an equally challenging time, Wolfgang Ischinger, who has his hands full right now with the Munich Security Conference coming up. So, round of applause for these guys. It is a great pleasure for Kimberly and me to be here and to have the honor of giving a brief welcome and maybe setting the tone a little bit for the presentations we're going to hear tonight. I must say that we very much look forward to getting to know all of you over the course of your time here. I was saying at the dinner table that we should, because I think you all took a tour but haven't had a chance to see the embassy, but I'd be happy to host a lunch, Gary, mark that down, in the embassy for everybody. And, so we should definitely do that. But we are familiar with so many of you as a result of your work, but have not had the chance to get to know you personally, and look forward to what we started tonight and to continuing that. So thank you very much, and congratulations on having this opportunity to be here. Without a doubt, there is a unique spirit to this place, the atmosphere that makes the American Academy a transatlantic treasure. It is a spirit of intellectual engagement across boundaries, international, intercultural, and interdisciplinary. This is exactly what the founders of the American Academy envisioned when it was established 20 years ago. I know that one of those founders, Richard Holbrooke, was passionate about the Academy. And I think we all know what it means when Dick Holbrooke was passionate about something. I worked in the Clinton White House, as Gary mentioned, in the 1990s, and was actually in the Oval Office for the conversation that resulted in Dick Holbrooke being appointed ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany. And when he tragically passed away far too soon, Hillary Clinton said that Dick Holbrooke's distinctive brilliance and unmatched determination make him one of a kind. Well, it was obvious 20 years ago that he was one of a kind, and his vision and his commitment certainly lives on here at the Academy. Over the years, as the American Academy has grown and developed, it has set an example to all those who value the partnership between Germany and the United States. A partnership that is based on the conviction that a strong Germany and a strong and unified Europe is a key to a stable, prosperous, democratic, and peaceful global community. Our common strategic interests make cooperation essential. Our common political values make cooperation possible. At the end of the day, both the interests and the values are insufficient. It is the fact that each of us brings something special to this relationship from something that the other can learn from and profit from that makes the German-American partnership valuable and makes the work of the American Academy so important. We must continue to learn from one another, especially during times like this of great change. And staying abreast of change is not just up to government. President Obama once said that the essence of what makes America special is our art, our culture, our history, our literature, and our science, all of which are represented in the work of our Berlin Fellows who are here tonight. History brought Germany and the United States together under very unique circumstances, out of which the extraordinary German-American partnership has grown and matured. Our dynamic economies, shared military engagements, proactive diplomatic initiatives and the use of soft power, innovative technology, and the entrepreneurial spirit of our young people, and most important, our willingness to engage with the world, both challenge and enrich the special status of our transatlantic partnership. And regarding advances in technology, as we've seen with the NSA debate, we can face challenges to that partnership when we discover that the need to defend our citizens and to provide for our mutual national security is confronted by our equally mutual commitment to individual privacy rights. All of these issues are ripe for discussion and reflection, and the American Academy is a terrific place for these kinds of thoughtful conversations. Earlier, I mentioned the need to stay abreast of change. Well, the talented and thoughtful people we're going to hear from tonight are the Academy Berlin Fellows. And on the subject of staying abreast of change and the challenges of transformation are almost a given here in Berlin. Just look at all the cranes, construction cranes you see around town. You can see it from a practical standpoint. But today, Berlin has a combination of toughness, glamour, creativity, experiential nightlife, which Kimberly and I have not really had too much of an opportunity to experience, and hopefully our daughters won't be doing too much of that either, and the affordable cost of living that made New York the world's cultural capital back in the 1960s. And of course, we Los Angelinos know that our city, which is Berlin's sister city, is also a cultural capital. Some may dispute that, but without a doubt, there's a current in the air here in Berlin that is almost electric, unleashing new ideas and sparking creative forces. And this is the world into which our fellows will be working in the next 3 months. Democracy and diversity, openness and pluralism are essential elements of the successful societies, and Berlin is a symbol of this process. It's not only the capital of a reunified Germany, but for decades it was a magnet for the adventurous and the disadvantaged. No city in Europe has changed more in the past century than Berlin, and in this century, it has already captured the imagination of many creative thinkers. This is the spirit of Berlin, which and when Dick Holbrooke and Henry Kissinger, Richard von Weizsäcker, Fritz Stern, Otto Graf Lambsdorff, John Kornblum, and others conceived of the idea for the American Academy, which has been so well executed by Gary Smith, that spirit, the spirit of Berlin, was woven into the fabric of this extraordinary institution. So I thank the friends and supporters of the American Academy for your commitment to a strong German-American relationship. I thank the staff for your initiative in finding ways to help Germans and Americans learn more about one another. And as I said, Kimberly and I are ready to do our part and hopefully have been doing our part over the past 5 months. We want to wish the Spring Fellows of 2014 a successful, productive, and interesting time here in Berlin. As incoming fellows, each of you has made the legacy and the challenge of the American Academy yours. May you each catch the spirit and remain devoted to the Academy and to our German-American partnership long after you leave this wonderful and aspiring house here on the banks of the Wannsee. Thank you so much.
Without further delay, my name is Linda Henderson, and I'm an art historian at the University of Texas in Austin. And I want to begin just by saying how grateful and honored I am to be a part of this remarkable institution and a group of wonderful fellows. I'm very, very pleased to be here. My project is entitled The Energies of Modernism, Art, Science, and Occultism in the Early 20th Century. And I think I can best convey the nature of this project by asking you a question. So I'm going to ask the question. When I say the term fourth dimension, die vierte Dimension, do you think of space or do you think of time? Raum oder Zeit? I suspect that most people think time. And I won't ask for a show of hands, but that's because of the gigantic presence of Albert Einstein in the 20th century. The coming of relativity theory and Einstein's space-time continuum, 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, redefined our thinking about the nature of space and time. And the curious thing for a cultural historian is to discover that most people didn't hear about Einstein until 1919, at the time of the Eclipse expedition that basically catapulted him to instant celebrity. And we historians who look at artists or writers of the early 20th century are in fact dealing with a culture that was very different, not defined in these Einsteinian terms. So this idea of a fourth dimension of space, if you had asked someone in 1910 what the fourth dimension was, they would definitely have said it was space. And it was a sign of a higher, invisible reality that might hold a greater truth, functioned in a variety of ways across culture. And that's something that gets lost with the popularization of Einstein. And as we look at artists then, people like Marcel Duchamp, Picasso, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Malevich, we need to understand what they thought about space. And in the same way that Einstein redefines the fourth dimension as time, there's another central concept of the early 20th century that also gets lost, and that is when he dismisses the idea of an ether of space. He doesn't say there's no ether, but he says it has no mechanical properties and hence is irrelevant to physics. But the ether of space was an idea that was so prevalent in the early 20th century. And as we look back at modern artists, we really need to recover this idea of the ether and those ideas then went with it to really think about what they understood matter to be, what they understood space to be. So my project is really one of recovering this distant idea. I think of myself, I'm not an archaeologist like Janet, but I think of myself as a kind of archaeologist of the early 20th century, finding these forgotten ideas that were so central to painters' thinking. So just to give you a sense, this is a moment where science is of great interest to the general public. It's something that is well-known. People are exhilarated by the discovery of the X-ray, radioactivity, wireless telegraphy. And the ether is part of this general worldview. And I just will read you one quotation from a book of 1905 called The New Knowledge, talking about the ether. Not only through interstellar spaces, but through the world also, and through our own bodies, all lie encompassed in it, not only encompassed in it, but soaking in it as a sponge lies soaked in water. How much we ourselves are matter and how much ether is in these days a very moot question. And when we recover this idea of an interpenetrating matter in space, ether, we look at Picasso's paintings, for example, and suddenly they make more sense to us. So my project here is really working on this recovery of the long-lost ether of space. You know it from the Ethernet, and that's a remnant of a much earlier moment. But in fact, it's a key part of not only modern art, but understanding modernism in general. Thank you.
My name is Ron Sooney. I'm Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago and currently Charles Tilly Collegiate Professor of Social and Political History at the University of Michigan. Next year will mark the 100th anniversary of one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. And the 20th century, of course, is a century marked by tremendously catastrophic events. And these are events that were planned and organized and carried out by a number of governments, undemocratic, often revolutionary governments. And I'm talking, of course, here of the deportation and mass killing of hundreds of thousands of Armenians and Assyrians, perhaps totaling more than 1 million victims by the Young Turk government of the Ottoman Empire. This event involved not only the physical elimination of the Armenians from a territory, Eastern Anatolia, the present-day Turkish Republic, a territory, by the way, that they had inhabited since at least the 5th century BC, but it also is, for present day, a foundational moment in what would a few years later emerge as the new Turkish National Republic founded by Mustafa Kemal. While most scholars today recognize this as the Armenian genocide, and by the way, I think the German word is particularly evocative, Volksmord, this subject is still the target of the Turkish government, which rejects any suggestion that their predecessor carried out such a mass murder or that it constitutes genocide. The events of 1915, in other words, are still controversial. But I can report, happily, that in the last 15 years, some Armenians and Turks, two peoples that are very much heavily burdened by history, have been trying to understand what happened in those dark years of World War I, and more importantly, why. The time has come, it seems to me, not for blame or denial, but for explanation. 15 years ago, when I first got interested in this event, though I was born an Armenian in America, so it was always in the ether, so to speak, the idea of Armenians and Turkish historians sitting down to discuss the traumatic last years of the Ottoman Empire would have been almost unthinkable. Yet progress has been made in the last several decades, and there has been, I would say, a profound shift in how scholars have dealt with these vexed questions of deportations and mass killing. With the emergence of a vibrant civil society in Turkey, the opening of negotiations on the possible entry of the Turkish Republic into the European Union, and the courageous forays by individual Turkish scholars to investigate the fate of the Armenians, along with, I would say, the dogged persistence of Armenians and other scholars, I would say a new paradigm has basically won the day, at least within the larger academy. Beginning in the year 2000, I and a Turkish colleague, Müge Göçek, at the University of Michigan, organized a series of conferences under the rubric Workshop on Armenian-Turkish Scholarship, which brought together a small number of Turkish, Armenian, Kurdish, and other scholars to discuss what happened and why at the end of the Ottoman Empire. The success was unexpectedly great. It reverberated in Turkey and Armenia. Turkish scholars went on to have their own conference in Bilgi University, though the government tried to stop it. There have been many setbacks, of course, most tragically the murder of one of our colleagues, the courageous Turkish-Armenian journalist Hrant Dink, who was a member from the beginning of our project. But I would say now it's almost impossible for serious scholars anywhere in the world to deny that a genocide occurred at the twilight of the Ottoman Empire. I'm afraid I can't say that about it. Governments, Turkey, of course, continues to deny, and the United States and Israel, among other governments, refuses to recognize 1915 as a genocide. So what am I doing here? Well, this semester at the American Academy, I'm finishing a small commissioned book on the Armenian genocide for Princeton University Press. I'm going to try to present for students and readers an analytical narrative of the background and processes of this genocide. I'm attempting to explain what I call the affective disposition, that is, the emotional universe, the way in which young Turks, and ordinary Turks as well, understood and constructed who they were and who their enemy was, and constructed indeed the Armenians as an existential threat to their empire, who should be eliminated in the name of national security. My only problem is, Gary, that this academy is so beautiful and so comfortable, the food is so good, the staff so helpful, the fellows so interesting, the temptations of Berlin so enticing that I may not get to finish this book. But I have to meet a deadline, and I'll try, because it would be senseless not to publish this book in 2015, the 100th anniversary, the year of the commemoration of this tragedy, which, among others, annihilated my great-grandparents. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich bin aus Bayern. Ich bin schon 2 Wochen lang in Berlin, aber ich habe noch nicht gelernt, wie man bräuselt. I'm Sylvia Nasser, and I'm a former reporter at the New York Times, and now I teach at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. I'd like you to imagine that it's the mid-1930s, the depths of the Great Depression, FDR, Stalin, Hitler are in power, there's a civil war going on in Spain. And imagine that you're a young American at Trinity College in Cambridge, very tall, very charming, very rich. You have an annual allowance in today's dollars of over $1 million. You arrive at Trinity with your valet. You have a small Picasso to hang on the wall. You charter a plane during one winter break. You race a racing car. But you're only half a playboy. You're also a Sir Galahad. Your parents are supporters and patrons of progressive causes, among them the New Republic magazine. You've traded dabbling in poetry for something serious, in other words, economics, and you've done so well that Maynard Keynes invites you to lunch. You have a social conscience. You join the British Communist Party, sort of secretly, but you also get elected to head the Cambridge Student Union. The Labour Party, as your graduation approaches, the Labour Party asks whether you might not consider becoming a naturalized British citizen and running for Parliament. So the world is in a crisis, but the world is your oyster. You're handsome, gifted, versatile, precocious, and virile. What on earth are you not? So the question that any novelist would ask, like Henry James asked about Isabel Archer, is, what will he do? What will he do? For Michael Straight, the future publisher of the New Republic and the future chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, for Michael Straight, the answer was he'll become a spy for one of the most murderous regimes in all of history. Just as his good friends, Guy Francis de Montcy-Burgess, his mentor, Anthony Frederick Blunt, and his talented NKVD case officer, Arnold Deutsch, knew he would. He was 20 years old. He was not only free, but he had the resources to make the most of his freedom. And this is what he chose. In his first report to Moscow Center, this is a few months before graduation, 1937. He's just come back from a quick trip to Washington, D.C., where he had tea with FDR and Eleanor. And he writes, spoke to Roosevelt and his wife. My parents know Roosevelt very well. I know Harry Hopkins in the Social Insurance Division, Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury. I could easily find any position. Michael Straight, with all of his wonderful qualities, his enormous advantages, the choices that other people could only fantasize about. Michael Straight was not alone. There were hundreds of people in the West who were also gifted, highly educated, people with choices who chose to do what Michael Straight did, to collaborate in one way or the other, as they rose to positions of great responsibility, great access, and sometimes influence in their respective governments, and who did so until not J. Edgar Hoover, and certainly not Joe McCarthy, but until disillusioned comrades of theirs blew the whistle. They included the man who ran the Treasury during World War II, the architect of Bretton Woods. They included the top State Department official who was responsible for organizing the United Nations. They included the British counterintelligence liaison with the FBI, the Polish-American envoy to the Soviet Union and the negotiations about the first Polish post-war government, the leading Keynesians in the United States, the White House top economic advisor, FDR's international troubleshooter, the scientific head of the Manhattan Project, the French High Commissioner for Atomic Energy, an American Vice President and Commerce Secretary, the top aide to the chief of the OSS, the U.S. economic advisor at the Potsdam Conference right down the road, the economics aide to the British cabinet minister and Bletchley Park codebreaker, a German economic minister, future, in exile in Britain, a BBC producer who goes on to be a Foreign Office flack, a British nuclear scientist, the British D-Day planner. They all played key roles in wartime Allied finance, in weapons development, in diplomacy, intelligence, and more often than not, they were committed to a post-war order based on the ideal of one world in comity with the Soviet Union. In other words, their day jobs and what they did, unbeknownst to the governments that they served, were intimately connected. I have the same questions as Henry James. What did they do? What were they thinking? How did the world look to someone who was super educated, sensitive, informed, that Stalin would look like a better alternative than FDR and Churchill? What were their dreams, and how close did they come to fulfilling them? That's the subject of my next book. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Matthew Goodhart. I'm the composer. I use the word composer in quotes, although it's how I'm usually titled here. I'm actually a pianist and improviser. My work manifests itself in a variety of forms, from what would be considered more traditional concert venues, string quartets, as well as free piano improvisations and what might be considered sound installations. While the variety of these forms may seem broad or at times contradictory or exclusionary, I see them as related. In fact, a lot of the works are really sort of hybrid forms. They're simply differing and necessary interconnected expressions of a central hub of ideas. I've composed and performed music since my earliest memories. I began my professional life primarily as a free jazz pianist. I was lucky enough in my early 20s to work with the tenor saxophonist Glenn Spearman, with the trumpet player from the AACM in Chicago, Wadada Lewis Smith, and ultimately worked with Cecil Taylor as well. One element of this set, or this stream of American musics that struck a particular chord, if you will, or was a seed for my present work, in addition to both the complexity of the sound and the sound world that these music evoked, as well as the way they exposed the socio-political nature of the performance ritual. But the seed that I'm pursuing in this fellowship here was really the connection between the intense physical demands that the music makes on its performers and how that intense physical demand manifests itself as part of the aesthetics of the work. In other words, deeply embedded within the syntax of the cultural expression was the relationship between the body and the instrument. As I began to develop my own approach to piano performance, especially using what I called extended piano techniques, doing a lot of plucking and scraping inside the strings. I was known for crawling underneath the piano and playing it that way, resonating things on the body, using the entire instrument. What I began to discover as I toured and went from piano to piano is that each piano differs dramatically in its construction. So the way these techniques would sound and be expressed on each instrument very dramatically. So therefore, each piece, each performance had to be constructed from the physical characteristics of the instrument itself. And this led me to a deeper exploration of composition and sound installation. This idea that the syntax of a piece of work, the harmonic, the timbral, and the temporal construction would come from the body of the instruments themselves that were being used. For the last 5 years or so, I have been working at the Center for New Music and Audio Technologies at the University of California, Berkeley. And I've developed a set of techniques that are primarily with metal percussion, though I've begun to extend them to string instruments and others as well, where the acoustic properties of particular gongs or cymbals are mapped out and analyzed and cataloged. And I've done recordings of playing the instruments in various ways. And you take all this data into a computer and you do what computers do. You change it around, you manipulate it, you use different kinds of synthesis. And then I take that information and turn it into sound and send it back into the instrument itself, the original instrument that all this stuff was taken from. And that's done, a lot of people ask me about this, it's done with what's called a transducer, which is essentially like a small speaker without the speaker cone, which is attached to the surface of the instrument, so that the instrument sounds seemingly by itself. Even though the sound is generated electronically, it's all acoustic when it actually reaches your ears. So my project here will be what's called, my project here will be a piece called For Five Scattered Ensembles. This combines live performers and 6 resonating gongs that have been treated in this way. The ensembles will be placed throughout the space. The gongs will be placed within the ensembles. The piece hopefully will last 45 to 50 minutes. And the audience will be in the center, surrounded by the bodies of the gongs, the bodies of the instruments, and hopefully dealing with their own relationship to the performance environment and to the instruments themselves. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm not Dominique Nabokov, but in past presentations I have, upon occasion, channeled a fellow who couldn't be here yet. And this semester is a bit unusual in that we have 4 fellows who are not yet present. Dominique and Dexter Filkins will be actually sharing a fellowship, so each of them will be here for 2 months. And at another duo span will be Laura Secor and George Packer, who will also be sharing a fellowship. They were here in 2009, where each of them did half of a fellowship, and now they're coming back to complete the fellowship. So they're not here with you now, but they are in spirit. Dominique Nabokov is a Dirk Ippen Fellow, and as a photographer who focuses on photography, photo reportage, photo essays, Dominique's work has appeared in many publications on both sides of the Atlantic, and she's shown in many museums and in collections. Her portraits of contemporary cultural figures, and indeed of anyone she photographs, are really very uncanny and disarming psychograms. She chronicles somehow this zeitgeist just through these simple portraits. She said that my camera is my pen. It was Bob Silvers, the legendary editor of the New York Review of Books, who brought Dominique Nabokov to our attention. He's a fervent champion of her and her work. And for over 3 decades, she has turned her camera lens on writers, poets, and colleagues at the New York Review of Books, producing incisive and intimate portraits of many of its key players. Dominique came actually to the Academy on the advice of Bob Silvers for a month in the fall of 2012 as the Marina Kellen French Distinguished Visitor to do preliminary research for a photo essay on Berlin. Actually, as a very young fiancée, she came with her late husband, Nicholas Nabokov, to Berlin when he was intendant of the Berliner Festwochen between 1964 and 1967. But she's only sporadically visited the city in the meantime. While at the Academy during the months of February and March, Dominique will work on her project, Berlin Living Rooms. This is the 3rd in her trilogy of books exploring what private spaces reveal about their inhabitants. In her first 2 books of this trilogy, she documented living rooms of well-known Parisians and New Yorkers, artists, writers, designers, intellectuals, and the occasional celebrity. Each room is shot simply as it happened to appear to her on that particular day without any people present. The result is a series of fascinatingly deadpan photos.
Good evening. My name is Brian Lynn. I was born in Hawaii in the same hospital as President Obama. Went to the same school as President Obama, and I'm a professor now at Texas A&M University. My project is titled Elvis's Army, Transformation and the Atomic Era Soldier, 1946 to 1965. It's a history of the unique organization that existed between the beginning of the Cold War and the beginning of the war in Vietnam. The project tries to answer 2 questions. The first is, how did the United States Army respond to the Cold War challenges of atomic weapons, international commitments, and the Soviet military threat? It studies the unprecedented changes, transformations, in weapons, organization, personnel, training, and other military subjects. And I anticipate this part of the book will make a substantial contribution to the current debate on military adaptation, military innovation, because today the United States Armed Forces are trying to break free of that very same Cold War legacy. The second question is how the Atomic Army, an authoritarian organization, if there ever was one, became the nation's most racially and economically egalitarian organization. For 2 decades, the Army was the only national institution where large numbers of Americans, black and white, rich and poor, urban and rural, college graduates and illiterates, had to live, work, train, and if necessary, fight together. This is the Army that was the most visible symbol of the United States for many Americans and many people in the Far East. So why the title Elvis's Army? Well, I believe that in many ways, and I am not an Elvis Presley fan, I don't believe he's been reincarnated but I believe that in many ways, Elvis Presley personified the U.S. Army's role in both military and social transformation. Like millions of other males of that time, he cut his hair, donned a uniform, underwent the rigors of military training, and became, by all accounts, a thoroughly competent soldier. His assignment in the elite 3rd Armored Division in Germany placed him on the most likely battlefield of the great Soviet-American conflict. And Elvis also personified the Army's role in social transformation. He went into the Army as the juvenile delinquent rebel of movies such as Jailhouse Rock. He emerged the clean-cut, fun-loving, but basically decent all-American boy he portrayed in the movie G.I. Blues, a movie that, as you know, was in part filmed in Germany. So I'm very honored to be included among the scholars at the American Academy in Berlin. I anticipate very many, and I've already had a few, interesting dialogues with my German colleagues, and I look forward to writing this book. Thank you.
It's hard to follow the Cambridge Spies and Elvis Presley, to say. I'm Susan Stewart, and I've come as a poet to this paradise of reading, writing, and magical desserts made of green pepper foam, which also have no calories, apparently. While I'm here, I'm working on 2 books. The first is a book of poems. And the main reason to write a book of poems is to surprise oneself and one's readers. And the less said in non-poetry about a book of poems, the better. Also, I'm quite superstitious about talking about poems that I haven't yet finished. So I'll stop right here and say no more about that work. But I'm also here to finish a draft of a book I've been working on for many years about representations of ruins in Western art and literature from the late Middle Ages to approximately British Romanticism and a little beyond. I'm trying to understand the answers to 2 issues: why we have a culture that values both novelty and signs of age so deeply, and why we insist upon our artworks as manifested material forms, forms that endure in time, for of course other cultures organize their art in other ways. So there's a trove of images from my research here in Berlin and also elsewhere in Northern Europe. And I found even in these few weeks that everywhere and every day in the city we confront the reality of problems of memory, destruction, and memorialization. Henry James felt that the study of ruins was a heartless pastime. But I feel very fortunate to be able to spend these months here at the Academy. So herzlichen vielen Dank.
I am Dennis C. Dickerson, James M. Lawson Jr. Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. Today in the United States, there is a celebration nationwide of the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., an iconic figure of service and sacrifice for social transformation in American society. He is greatly remembered for his importance as a soaring orator and great preacher, and a man who singularly helped to transform American society from one of segregation in full inclusion of its citizenry. However, Martin Luther King Jr. owed a great intellectual debt to a previous generation of African American religious intellectuals, one of whom is the subject of my work here at the Academy. My topic is a brother in the spirit of Gandhi, William Stewart Nelson, and the religious origins of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King is very well known. William Stewart Nelson is very little known. He was a man of great cosmopolitan sensibilities, a veteran of World War I, saw action in France as a first lieutenant, returned to France and studied at the Sorbonne and later at the University of Berlin and at Marburg, returned to Howard University as an administrator and later dean of the seminary, the School of Religion at Howard, became very interested in Gandhi. Under the sponsorship of the American Friends Service Committee, went to India during the academic year 1946-1947 to study the congruence between Quaker pacifism and Gandhian nonviolence. And while in India, he came to know Gandhi in his final years, was present with Gandhi, for example, in the immediate aftermath of the partition of India and Pakistan, was present with Gandhi as he quelled a riot between the Hindus and the Muslims, and learned firsthand the power, the invigorating power of nonviolence. Upon returning to the United States as a seminary professor, as a lecturer, as a great speech maker, and a great writer, he became, in the background, America's acknowledged expert on Gandhian nonviolence, and became a very important consultant to King and a whole generation of civil rights activists. When one hears their speeches, when one notes their vocabulary, their ideas, and their tactics, they all resonate with William Stewart Nelson. I'm engaged in this biographical excavation during this semester.
Dexter Filkins is our other Dirk Ippen Fellow, sharing it with Dominique Nabokov, and he'll be here in April and May. Dexter Filkins is one of, if not the premier war journalist of his generation, and yet another of the staff writers at The New Yorker whom we've had the pleasure of hosting here at the American Academy. Prior to his move to The New Yorker, Filkins had worked with The New York Times, reporting from Afghanistan, Pakistan, New York, and Iraq, where he was based from 2003 to 2006. In his book, The Forever War, Filkins writes about the remarkable chain of events that began with the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s, continued with the attacks of 9/11, and moved on to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The book won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Best Nonfiction Book and was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, and Boston Globe. In 2009, Filkins won a Pulitzer Prize as part of the New York Times team for groundbreaking coverage of America's deepening military and political challenges in Afghanistan and Pakistan. During his time here at the Academy, he was going to work on a historical novel that moves between Europe and Pakistan, his first fiction work.
My name is Leslie Dunton Downer. I'm a writer based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I am here at the Academy to work on a project telling a story about how I, as an opera librettist, was working on a libretto for my composer on a story about map-making spies in the 1860s in Central Asia during the Great Game era, an opera about that would have involved Russian, English, Persian, and Tibetan languages. And while working on that project, was invited to visit the place where I was setting the principal action in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan. That was in 2000, and I didn't know whether to accept the invitation because the country was still in the dregs of a civil war, but I did go. And while I was there for about 5 weeks in Gorno-Badakhshan, an autonomous region of Tajikistan on the border of Afghanistan and China, I listened to a number of musicians and fell madly in love with the voice of a singer who was a young Muslim singer in a village, a hamlet really, singing lyrics by Jalaluddin Rumi. And while I didn't know any Tajik or Persian, I knew at that time, on hearing this voice, that I would have to write for this voice sometime. And as soon as I left the country, I persuaded my composer that we should maybe make a piece for this voice. And a series of things happened. And to let you know, I tried to learn Tajik, but because this was before 9/11, really Tajikistan wasn't on many people's radars. I ended up learning classical Persian instead, so I could communicate with this singer in the language that he sang rather than spoke, and eventually learned Tajik and lived with this singer and other musicians from Tajikistan who happened to arrive and live with me and my family in Paris during the events of 9/11, which also for them included the events of 2 days prior, which involved the slaughter of Commander Massoud, who was a Tajik ethnic from their region. So this is a project to tell the story of what happened, how we influenced each other by listening to one another and learning about each other's cultures and living through the terrorist events together. I would also say that it's a project about the dangers of listening, how people's lives can be transformed in ways they don't expect if you're vulnerable to the powers of things like music and lyric and other things, and also the even graver dangers of not listening, because I think there are many places in the world we aren't listening. But let me also just finish with a note saying that when I turned in my topic for my talk, which will be next month, and I hope you can come and hear it, I put together a note for the Academy saying something about listening, and I thought it was really an unimpeachable description of my project in the best possible liberal humanistic terms, because it involved listening, which is such a noble act and beautiful word in English at that time anyway. And I have to say that, of course, you know what happened is approximately 5 minutes after I submitted that my talk proposal to the Academy, Snowden's leaks occurred, and I was trying to brush up on my German for coming to Berlin, and noticed that along with beautiful variations on hören, like anhören, there were more things like, zuhören and mithören, and then there was the handy story of abhören, and it just got worse and worse, and then there was sort of aufhören, just sort of thought, this is really not good. I can't believe that this word, the idea of listening, has now been contaminated. Deeply grateful to Ambassador Emerson for doing what he can to repair the situation. And secondly, I wanted to also say that listening is, to me, a very important thing. And as I hail from Cambridge, Massachusetts, I come from a community of transparency activists and transparency advocates. And I told the people here at the Academy that I wanted to learn about what was going on here in Berlin in realms to do with transparency activism. And I was asking if I could go and sit in and listen to what's going on in that community. I've been so lucky in the very few weeks I've been here, not only getting to hear some work at the Deutsche Oper and also at the opening night of the Avant-Garde Music Festival, but also I thought they were going to send me to like the Computer Chaos Club or some like Netz Kultur meeting planning something with WikiLeaks or something, but instead they sent me to a fascinating meeting of high-level lawyers representing business clients in Germany who were very concerned and had invited over a number of people from the United States and the EU to talk about the implications of the Fourth Amendment and relevant European laws and the culture of listening. So I'm really here to change the initial topic that I had. I was originally not going to think anymore about spying issues or listening in that way and write about something else. But now, as I'm in Berlin right now, under these circumstances, my project is changing, and I'm thrilled to be in a place where people care about listening, and I think it's going to change a lot. Like you said, the cranes are out, and I'm ready for it to change while I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Leatham, and I'm the Roy E. Disney 51 Professor of Creative Writing at Pomona College, which title makes it sound like I'm a very credible academic, but I'm not. I'm a ringer in academia. I teach creative writing at a college, of course, because I'm a novelist, and so I was sort of brought in from the cold to do that work. I've written 9 novels, the most recent of which was finished less than a year ago and published in the United States in September, and is actually just being published in Germany and the UK in the next couple of weeks, which is a preamble to saying that I know less about what I'm doing in this time here at the Academy than probably any of my fellows. I feel this great affinity with you as you describe your projects, because whether you're outright historians or whatever the nature of your scholarly inquiry, you're all terrific storytellers. I mean, I was just listening and thinking, I'm going to come up here and tell the very worst story of the night because of the dearth of my own understanding of what I'm doing at this point. But I am gathering materials towards my 10th novel while I'm here. It feels like a watershed moment for me, not only because of the number 10, and also because I'm turning 50 in a couple of weeks, but because the nature of writing novels is that you know a tremendous amount after you finish them, and each one delivers you in some strange way into the atmosphere that will produce the next. And what I have right now is predominantly atmosphere, but my last novel was a very important one, an exciting one for me, partly because I broke through a boundary into something very specifically more global in my subject matter. There is a chapter in the preceding novel that's set in Nicaragua, and another called From the Stasi Files, which purports to be a sheaf of letters rescued from the shambles of the Stasi headquarters here in Berlin after, the wall comes down and various activists go and sort of claim those office materials. And this was a surprising turn in my own work, and a really thrilling one. And it has made me know that the kind of atmosphere that my next novel is going to consist of is an even more pronouncedly international one. I think the writing that I've been doing has led up to this, and the reading I've been doing has led me to this place, the kinds of novels that matter the most to me in my own exploration. Have been more and more novels that refuse to be limited by national character or national boundary, but instead, in some way, deal with the sort of unavoidable contemporary fact of the global experience of self, the mediated internationally and transnationally mediated nature of the self in the present life. And so being an expatriate right now is wildly appropriate to this investigation. And I'm sorry not to be able to say more specifically about what I'm writing about. I've got thoughts about a character who is a professional backgammon player in Japan. I've got thoughts about a character who grows up in New York City but becomes the press secretary to a drug lord, drug warlord in Thailand. And I've got thoughts, obviously, very exciting ones about Europe and about Germany and Berlin specifically. And I don't know where they're going. But I will just add one other thing, which is that along with identifying with all your superbly well worked out narrative investigations and hoping that I can equal them with my inventions. Matthew, in certain circles, I was also very well known for crawling under pianos at one point. So I identify with that as well. Yeah, I just couldn't be more excited to be here, and thank you oh so much for the hospitality and the assistance and the cooking and all the rest of it. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Richards. I'm the token archaeologist, and by definition, I get to be a little more rough and ready. Sorry. Let me just say, Gary, actually, if you've never thought of the Academy as a dig house before, you should. Because if anything characterizes a dig house that's running successfully anyway, it's that everything is taken care of so that you can work your crew, if not to death, get them to exchange ideas and just focus and concentrate on their work. And this is a real gift to be here, and thank you so much. Although my cook at the Abitus Dig House has a lot of catching up to do, I will say that, not to mention the elegance of the facilities. So, as I said, I am an archaeologist. My background is in anthropology and French, so I approach archaeological and literary phenomena from social science and humanities perspectives. The chance to be here at the Academy follows on an opportunity I had some years ago to participate in a joint American Philosophical Society and Humboldt Foundation conference, German-American Frontiers of Humanities, which was one of the most electrifying experiences of my intellectual life. So it's a real gift to be able to pursue those kinds of conversations again. So I'm a professor of Egyptology and a curator for dynastic Egypt at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ron and I never met until we met here. I also direct a large-scale archaeological excavation at the site of Abydos in southern Egypt. Also links to Germany, the German Archaeological Institute has a project in a different part of this enormous site, has had for decades now. And Lepsius was the first systematic archaeologist, historian, to visit my part of the site, which dates to about 4,200 years ago. My project is entitled Writing Ancient Lives, Weni the Elder and Ancient Egyptian Responses to Political Crisis. And going last like this in the sequence, I've been sitting there nodding, because I think a lot of us are engaged in writing biographies of people, of places, of intellectual approaches to people and places. A lot of us are dealing with politics, which is part of the gift of being here. This work is something that I started excavating at Abydos in the mid-1990s. This book project has been quite a while developing. There was another book in between that and now. But it took a whole different direction some years ago when the Journalism Fellows Program at the University of Michigan asked me to think and give a talk about political crisis in ancient Egypt and government responses to political crises of authority. And so I started looking for the first time in a targeted way at political rhetoric. And because we're talking about a time period in ancient Egyptian history when probably less than 5% of the population was literate, you have to think about, in this age, pre-mass communication, pre-literacy, how are political elites getting their message out in these times of crisis of authority? And for that lecture, I looked at the time period of Nefertiti, some 3,000 something years ago. And I also looked at a period 1,000 years earlier than that, and darned if Obama wasn't Senwosret III of the 12th dynasty, dating about 2000 BCE, and Horemheb, who succeeded Nefertiti's husband, was John McCain. So you start to notice, plus ça change, right? I mean, the content and the framing and the kinds of stories on which political rhetoric is hung, I'm here to tell you, has not changed in thousands and thousands of years. It hasn't. Back up to 2200 BCE, so now we're more than 4,000 years in the past. At the site of Abydos, the low desert surface of which has remained sacrosanct since about 3250 BC, when the first kings of unified Egypt were buried there. Suddenly, at the end of the Old Kingdom, 150 years after the Great Pyramids at Giza are built, the 5th and 6th dynasty kings start developing the site that's been held taboo to any activity whatsoever, because it's sacred to these early kings, because there's this idea that the god Osiris of the dead is actually buried at Abydos. And they drop down these elite graves, and they develop a monumental landscape that communicates, that transforms over time, and writing biographies of this place, both visually and spatially and narratively, of specific people, like Winnie the Elder and his network, and they even pull the god Osiris into it, all as part of a response to a perceived crisis of authority that has happened after a state that's been in existence for more than 800 years, and centralization is starting to unspool. And what happens after, actually we were talking a lot among ourselves about trying to keep this Kurzenbündig. We didn't keep it Kurzenbündig, and now I'm not doing it either, for which apologies, so I'll try to wrap this up quickly. I was thinking this morning that it's actually cool for me that yesterday was the day that we did the Berlin City Tour. And what were we doing but driving around communicative landscapes that would, components of which would be established for very specific purposes by very specific people or parties, and then would erode, crumble, be modified, be contested, be transformed, and sort of rise again in a new form. And that's what's happening at Abydos. And what I'm planning to use this blessed time at the Academy to do is to refine down my project, because like you, Leslie, I feel like it's a labyrinth. We were in the field this last spring, and we made a discovery that turned over half of what we've been thinking about the site, just after all these years of digging there. So I want to circumscribe the project and also use this opportunity in conversation, in reading, and getting to know German colleagues in the city to really get on top of the political science literature on political rhetoric, content, framing analysis, performance, and so on. So thank you all.
Good evening. So I am Latoya Ruby Frazier. I am a photographer and media artist from Braddock, Pennsylvania. Braddock, Pennsylvania is a steel mill town. It's a historic steel mill town located 9 miles outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So for some of you, I just said Pittsburgh because most people don't know where the hell Braddock is. So what I'm going to be doing here are 3 different things, but before I get to that, I want to underscore why it's important that I'm connecting Braddock, Pennsylvania with Berlin, Germany. My family dates back 4 generations. We are a steel mill, working class, blue collar family. And Gramps, who is someone I've photographed in all my work. So for example, I've collaborated with my work, with my family for 12 years, making portraits, still life, and landscapes, documenting how our bodies have deteriorated with the social and economic landscape of Braddock. Gramps was one of the few African-American men that worked in Andrew Carnegie's steel mill and was able to retire with a pension. We know historically that that wasn't the case for many of the men. My grandmother, Ruby, grew up there in the 30s when it was prosperous and booming, even though we had the FSA photographers photographing the Great Depression in the South. My mother grew up there in the 50s during segregation and white flight and all the things that occurred after the GI Bill. And I grew up there in the 80s after the Reagan administration, once the steel industries collapsed and the war on drugs decimated my family and community. And when you find yourself in the position as a teenager without any authority or economic power, the one thing I knew I could do was do what Gordon Parks did, And we know that Gordon Parks used his camera to fight against everything he didn't like about America, which was poverty, discrimination, and intolerance. So I began to pick up the camera as a teenager to photograph the aftermath of what wasn't being reported, which is families that were left behind once all the businesses closed and we were redlined there without any government support or even local support. It's a story that's never been permitted to be told. It's never been archived. It's never been documented. There's no voice or history on behalf of people like my family. And there are many people that are still there today, currently, that are now being discriminated against because they're not being included in the revitalization, redevelopment, or gentrification of Rust Belt towns in America. And so with all of that on my mind, I'm going to be publishing my first book. It will be published by Aperture Foundation in New York City. That book is scheduled to come out fall 2014, so I will be wrapping up that book while I'm here quietly in my studio. The second thing I'm going to be doing is going to Eisenhüttenstadt to take a look at what's happening in the East here with families that share the same exact narrative and history that my family shares. I'm looking to make a cross-cultural connection with them, despite any of our country's histories or turmoil. And the third thing, and why I'm really excited and why this is such a blessing and an honor to be here, is because I'm very committed and interested to the philosophies of Walter Benjamin and the Frankfurt School theorist. And we have a wonderful Walter Benjamin scholar here, which is Gary Smith, so I'll be reaching out to you. And the other thing, which was a big surprise, was coming here, meeting Professor Dennis C. Dickerson, who happens to have all of the research done and images to complete my first book. So it was quite a remarkable surprise. I had actually watched a documentary film done by Tony Buba, a very important documentary filmmaker from Braddock, Pennsylvania. Dennis was one of the people featured in the film talking about the history of what happened to African American steelworkers. And I wrote his name down in a notebook, hoping to reach out and meet him one day. And of course, it's here at the Academy that I'm meeting him. So I'm really thankful and looking forward to all of this. And I would like to close with a quote that I think by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., since it is this important day, and it resonates with the Frankfurt School theorists and Walter Benjamin. It's from Strength to Love, his book from 1963, in the chapter, A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart. This prevalent tendency toward soft-mindedness is found in man's unbelievable gullibility. Take our attitude toward advertisements. We are so easily led to purchase a product because a television or radio advertisement pronounces it better than the other. Advertisers have long since learned that most people are soft-minded, and they capitalize on this susceptibility with skillful and effective slogans. This undue gullibility is also seen in the tendency of many readers to accept the printed word of the press as final truth. Few people realize that even in our authentic channels of information, the press, the platform, and in many instances, the pulpit, do not give us objective and unbiased truth. Few people have the toughness of mind to judge critically and to discern the true from the false, the fact from the fiction. Our minds are constantly being invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and false facts. One of the great needs of mankind is to be lifted above the morass of false propaganda. Thank you.
So the next two fellows that I'm channeling are George Packer and Laura Secor, both Axel Springer Fellows. George Packer, staff writer at The New Yorker, won the 2013 National Book Award in Nonfiction for the unwinding and inner history of the new America. Echoing John Dos Passos' USA trilogy, Packer weaves together longer narrative accounts of a number of main characters, short biographies of influential figures, and collections of newspaper headlines and song lyrics. While in Berlin, George Packer will be working on a biography of the American Academy's founder, Richard C. Holbrooke. The book will trace Holbrooke's career from Vietnam in the early 1960s through the Balkans in the mid-1990s to Afghanistan and Pakistan, his last diplomatic mission. He's been granted exclusive access to Holbrooke's extensive collection of notes, journals, and tapes. So he hopes to tell not only Holbrooke's story, but also the story of American power in the last decades of the American century, from the perspective of a man who was deeply involved in the major events. Laura Secord is an independent journalist and editor with exceptional insight into Iran's political culture. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic Monthly, The New Republic, and other publications. During her time here, she will be completing her book, Fugitives from Paradise, which builds on magazine work she published in The New Yorker from 2005 to 2012. The book chronicles the emergence of the Green Movement for democratic reform within the Islamic Republic of Iran. Her approach is part intellectual history, part political narrative, and part biography of a group of individuals whose lives became entwined with the political structure, with the political struggle within the Islamic order. Secord delves into several interpretations of Iran's contentious 2009 elections, that Ahmadinejad was more popular than elites had thought, that the elections were staged, that the protesters were merely incidental and in no way a meaningful challenge to the social order of the Islamic Republic. Secord insists that all these interpretations need to be seen in the light of the recent past. With a narrative scope both broad and deep, Secord delves into the reform movement's roots in demographics and the history of ideas in Iran and in the West. So she's hoping to complete this book during her stay here. Before we adjourn to reception, where everyone is invited to meet the fellows, engage in conversations with them, I'd like to just introduce Richard Haas to you, who is here as our distinguished visitor, our Lloyd Cutler distinguished visitor. And tomorrow night he will be giving a talk here, but as a distinguished visitor, I would appreciate it if you said a couple of words here about Berlin and your stay with us. Thank you.
Unlike everyone you've heard from, one, I haven't prepared, and two, I am jet lagged. It's great to be back here. This is an extraordinary facility. What Gary and so many others have built here. It's important for lots of reasons. I spent my entire life essentially dedicated to the idea that ideas matter. And this is an institution that is likewise dedicated to that. And it's dedicated to Germany and US-German relations at a time it's not that fashionable. And very few people in my business, and I'm in the business of foreign policy and international relations, are making this their priority. So what's going on here is important for the United States, for Germany, and beyond. So it's good to be a small part of it. Tomorrow night I'll talk about the book that I recently published. And it's a book I never thought I'd write. It's called Foreign Policy Begins at Home, and it's how the biggest threat to the United States is not China, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's essentially ourselves. And it's the intellectual disarray in which we find ourselves about what it is we're trying to do in the world. And it is the political disarray we find ourselves at home, and our inability to essentially make our economy grow at the levels it can and should, and increasingly our inability to come together to do a lot of the things that we need to do to maintain the foundation stones, if you will, of American power. And one of my themes is that everyone has a stake in our getting it right. Because if the United States is unable or unwilling to play a large role in the world, I'm afraid everyone will pay a price. The world does not organize itself very well. For those of you who study college economics, there's no Adam Smith out there in the geopolitical marketplace. There's no invisible hand. It actually takes at times, the visible hand of leading countries, and there's no other set of countries or country with either the capabilities or the habits of world leadership. So if the United States does not sort itself out, I believe we will all collectively pay an enormous price. And I know this may not be fashionable right now here, because people are cranky, to say the least, about the United States over the NSA issue. And I've been thinking about it, and Wolfgang Ischinger and I were talking about it at some length today. Think about it. Here it is. It's 2014, and it's the 25th anniversary of the end of the Cold War, on, of all days, 11/9, which to Americans has a special ironic resonance. So if you're under 40 and you're under 45, in some ways you've come of age in a post-Cold War world. And you therefore tend to take a lot of things for granted, and you tend not to see the United States as a country that worked closely with its European partners and essentially making sure that the last era of history turned out as well as it did. So when I come here and I see people as taken as they are, shall we say, with the entire NSA experience, or more recently, say, with what the United States did in places like Iraq, I'm worried that this becomes, if you will, the framing by which a lot of people coming of age now are seeing the United States and approaching international relations. I think it's a dangerous, unhealthy, even if understandable, phenomena. So again, it's I think places like this, indeed there aren't places like this. An institution such as the American Academy here has an important role or mission to play to really help coming generations sort out this question of what will be the nature of U.S.-German relations. I think we, in the book I've just written, have to think out what's the nature of America's relationship with the world, and Germans have to increasingly ask their questions about themselves. What is going to be the nature of Germany's relations with the world? I would, at the risk of ending on a controversial note, Germany has been an underperformer in international relations quite consciously. And the issue is, will it continue to underperform, to essentially have a role in the world that is far less than its capabilities would potentially let it play? It's a choice, but what you don't do in life often has as much consequence as what it is you choose to do. And so again, I think the sorts of issues that are debated in a gathering such as this are vital to the collective future. So I am two things. I'm thrilled to be back here, and I'm also, it is hard not to be wowed, just completely blown away by the talent, both the depth and the scope of the talent we've just heard from, which, despite my last book, makes me feel pretty good about the future of my own country. Thank you very much.